We established UCD Centre for Irish Towns as an academic centre to try to connect dots across disciplines and across scales and across agents, both to look within the university, but also beyond its borders to engage with stakeholders, agencies, communities on the ground, and other research institutions, both nationally and internationally. We want to better understand our towns, to rethink the future of our towns, and to reimagine what they're now for, to consider how best they can adapt to be resilient, healthy, connected places to live in that are inclusive and diverse. So it became apparent that there is an extraordinary breadth and range of really exciting work and research going on in all corners of UCD at many levels and many scales. And so with the help and the support of the Earth Institute, we hope that this Talking Town seminar series can offer a glimpse of some of this research activity and can prompt conversations in response to emerging themes of importance that are related to towns in Ireland. I particularly want to thank Katrina Devery, Sarah Cotterill and Pauline Power for all their work in planning and producing the Talking Town series. So we've got 3 sessions coming up before the end of this year and more sessions in the pipeline for 2022. They will all take place at lunchtime on the first Thursday of the month. So seminar 2 is going to be on the theme of community participation and design in planning in towns. And speaking at that would be Sarah Cotterill, Sophia Mires and Tim Shea. Seminar number 3 is to do with the just transition and Irish towns. That'll be on Thursday, the 2nd of December. And the lineup for that at the moment is Aparajita Bandari, Alma Clavin and Sean McCabe. So that promises to be, I think, a really exciting discussion. So on to today's event. I'm just going to start with a quote as part of the introduction that one of our students brought up yesterday in a dissertation tutorial from Finance Minister Pascal Donoghue. And the quote says that one of the issues that we have had is that we don't have enough accurate data set to genuinely understand what is the quantity of property that's completely unused. So this is a finance minister speaking in the media about data in relation to vacancy and towns and cities. And indeed, Housing for All, the latest government policy on housing, has a whole action section related to vacancy on towns. So action 19.12 is to collect data on vacancy levels in residential property with a view to introducing a vacant property tax in quarter 2 of 22. And that is an action by the Department of Finance, interestingly. And of course, vacancy and use is just one of the metrics for which data is important in order to better understand our towns. But I think that the 2 points above illustrate how much that is a part of policy and economics and the state of play that we have within the emerging present and future of our towns. Our 3 speakers today will illustrate in different ways, which connects with their own research and how data is connected with Irish towns. So I'm really excited to welcome them all to be here with us today. Just to say the format for this session, we'll have 3 speakers who speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we have time for Q&A afterwards. If you could put any questions you have into the chat, and Katrina and I will try to look at those and moderate them for a discussion after the 3 speakers have concluded. The seminar is going to be recorded and it will be added to our online YouTube channel for those who wish to access it at a later date. So our first speaker today is Dr. Karen Keaveney. Karen is a rural geographer and planner, and her research interests span rural planning, rural development, and agricultural education. She is assistant professor in the School of Agriculture and Food Science and head of subject for rural development. Previously, Karen was a lecturer in rural spatial planning in Queen's University, Belfast. She has expertise in local decision-making and governance, rural power relations, and socio-economic change in the countryside. And her publications and research include the areas of policy responses to rural change, cross-border and interjurisdictional planning, local government reform, and planning on the island of Ireland. And Karen is also a very vibrant member of our CFIP working group. So to introduce Karen now, she's going to speak today about understanding data needs for participatory democracy. Karen, over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'll do the whole share thing here. So just if somebody can let me know, you can see that. I still haven't got used to presenting in a vacuum to nobody. Okay, thank you very much, Orla. That's great. And I'm delighted to be presenting today. And it's been a pleasure working with Orla and Philip and all others in setting up the Centre for Irish Towns over the last couple of years. It's been a highlight of the remote working that we've been doing since all has changed. So today I'm going to talk about data for participatory democracy. I'm kind of doing that annoying thing of I'm talking about it as I start a project on the area, but I will also be drawing on other projects as well that I've been working on. So stop that from showing there. So today I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about representation, so how we actually represent places, and particularly rural places. I'm going to talk data for remote places, and then finish up by looking at place-based responses and co-design, which are really central to a lot of the work that I do. So representation, I'm not going to talk for too long on this, but I think it's really, really important because how we look at data is also really, really interlinked with how we represent places. And often those two can be at odds with each other. And so, you know, we have a tendency sometimes to rely on anecdotal evidence and highly emotive evidence bases for how we make decisions about rural places. And so I think it's really important to highlight that. Part of the problematic around that is that particularly for rural places, there's a lot of taken for granted notions about what rural is. And it can be really, really tied in with kind of a mythology and idealization and idealization of places. And also this is tied in with the fact that we have a very strong agricultural lobby in Ireland, which tends to dominate the rural voices and hence has a stronger influence on policy, when sometimes maybe that influence doesn't always match the actual data on the ground in terms of how many people are working in farming, just as an example. And so as a result, particularly over the last 20 years, there has been a lack of evidence bases for decision making, or at least application of those evidence bases. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the really good data that we have in Ireland. On top of all of that, there has been, again, up till now, a limited focus on towns. And again, that's tied in with this kind of myth building around rural places, in the sense we tend to, in our mind's eye, think of the rural as possibly that photograph I have in the background, this open, sweeping countryside, when in fact it's very diverse and it is a mix of urban and remote. So bringing me on to data for remote places. And really the first question I would pose and just want you to think about is, what is actually remote? One's remote is another person's center. So, and in many ways what COVID brought to our minds was really where we lived, and those restrictions that we had from the 2 kilometers to the 5 kilometers really brought to a fore where we live and what is close to us. And generally where we live and where our day-to-day lives play out, that is actually the center of our universe. So to say it is remote is somebody else putting a label on it. And it's really, really important to kind of think about how we interact with places. If you're based in Dublin or somewhere in an urban place, you may look at other places and feel everywhere else is remote. But actually, I live, which is obviously the center of the universe in Roscommon, you know, to me, that's not overly remote, but it might be to somebody else. And you can see here, we have a series of towns in Ireland. And yes, clearly we have a much stronger urban structure to the east of the country. But all of those dots in their various sizes show central places. So even on the most, what we might perceive to be remote places, there are centers of activity. And usually those are towns, and they're very, very central to how people living in and around those places live out their daily lives. So what, and in particular, COVID has highlighted to us the vulnerabilities of these places, but not really that remoteness is an issue, but actually that the other elements, like we have less diversified economies than urban places. In rural places, a higher share of workers' essential jobs, such as in agriculture and food processing, and then also a limited capability to undertake these jobs from home, making teleworking a challenge. Where remoteness may come into play is we, of course, have poorer access to services, and there is undoubtedly a larger digital divide. And we also have older populations in rural places, and they're actually the challenges. So sometimes it's not the physical distance from places, all the elements that impact on the geography. And of course, over the last year and a half, the word and term remote has come into our language, our everyday language. And obviously we think more and more of remote working, and that idea that there is a movement. And while early days of COVID, you could see that there was at least anecdotal evidence to say there was movement from urban to rural places. But we are beginning to see that movement is happening to a certain extent. And I'll talk about, I have another slide in a minute about a project that I'm working on in that area. So are we talking about remote data or remote places? So there is a perceived lack of digital data and technologies in remote, rural or peripheral or dispersed settings. And that really is a challenge for the establishment of strong evidence bases for sustainable development. There is a real push in current policies for rural places, such as our rural future and then the national planning framework, that identify the urgency to address the challenges for evidence bases. And in work that I'm about to start, I'm going to be looking at how robust data-driven social, economic and environmental evidence bases can be established for rural geographies, and also how rural citizens can engage with that data. This is a slide from, it's from a project I'm currently working on, the In Place project, which is looking at pre and post COVID commuting and impacts in rural towns. And this slide is, some of you may be familiar with some of the Google analytics data coming out, and has been coming out since early last year, which is looking at how we're using different, now this is county level data, this is for County Clare. But I think some of this is really interesting in terms of we appear to be using our rural place differently. Now, while this is at county level, a lot of this activity is happening in towns. And as we look at this graph, obviously below the line when footfall and movement was much lower, that correlates with the lockdowns. But this is just from up till the end of August, beginning of September. You can start to see, compared to previous times, we are using our public spaces differently in more rural settings. And I think that's going to be really interesting data to try and break down and look at as we go on. Also, and this was another project I was working on with some colleagues from the School of Agriculture, Marky and Adele Kelly. We did this work for NET. We were looking at vitality ratios, and really, you can really see that towns have the greatest vitality, and these are the areas in the pinks in the rural setting. And I think what my point here is there's some really interesting data that can be applied, and we're really fortunate in Ireland to have a very strong sense. The CSO is a fantastic organisation for the data that it produces, and also the analysis it actually undertakes, and really good organisation to work with. And luckily we'll have a census now happening next year. It's obviously been delayed, and I think there's going to be some really interesting things coming out of that. So in terms of those remote places and remote data, finally I just want to talk about place-based responses and co-design. So really, we need to bring together established community and cooperative networks in rural areas, current rural development strategies around the smart village concept, and also community-led local development, which we're really good at in Ireland, together with digital technologies and data to engage citizens in co-design for sustainable futures. And really, for me, it's about bringing together three key elements if we're going to make good decisions with people in rural places and in towns. We really want to bring together the localities, so where spatial practices play out and are linked to consumption or production activities. We also need to include formal presentations, such as through official data and political discourse of the rural. And then the challenging bit is bringing in people's everyday lives, which are the most challenging to capture, but the richest, and give the depth of insight into the and co-design for places. The four co-design are power between people, power and balance. When we talk about places, policy around places, we have to prioritize relationships, building trust between people. Participatory means and build capacity. And finally, we are in these a strong approach to places, so that includes from economic to social and environmental, and to include all. Finally, we're really conscious of time. I think the key is to move away. When we look at town but rural places, we need to move away from old binaries of urban divide and also core periphery. Limitations of the fewer fetish spatial relations and really central and really can understand play beyond to include the living in the localities in the decision making.
Karen, thank you so much. It's in a way, it's kind of interesting that we speaking about data and technologies and rural areas. There was, I think, some sound issues on the line, but I think we caught most of it. And obviously, if there's any questions that you caught, maybe some of what Karen's saying, please put them in the chat if you'd like her to maybe just elaborate on it. I particularly liked the sense of kind of how data can support a more nuanced understanding of what are often considered quite binary poles of a rural and urban. It's often called the rural-urban divide. But as somebody who lives in a town, I can offer testament to both your map of the vitality of towns and also about that nuance that it's. I think it's often that binary description of something being rural or being urban is perhaps less helpful than a more blended or pluralistic model. So thank you very much, Karen. I know it's very difficult to know as well when you're speaking on Zoom that there might be some feedback as well, but it's all part of our modern digital dependent way of life. Okay, we'll move on to our second speaker, Jennifer Keenahan. And Jennifer is assistant professor in civil engineering in UCD. Her research focuses on the use of computational fluid dynamics for the built environment. And I, for one, are looking forward to hearing about what that actually is and what it means. And Jennifer's research is particularly interested in wind analysis around using computational fluid dynamics. She's head of teaching and learning in the School of Engineering and teaches across engineering and also architecture, building working relationships between engineers and architects, really important. So Jennifer is going to be speaking today about data and wind modelling for pedestrian comfort in the built environment. Jennifer, I'll hand over to you.
That's great.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Orla. I'll share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. So there's two projects that I want to focus on today. The first of which is the Point Village exostructure. So this, I believe, is now completed, but because we've all been at home with the pandemic, I've not been able to get out and see it recently. This is a large L-shaped building that has been constructed next to what most of us would know as the Point Depot, or now the 3 Arena. And this is a short kind of impression, or artistic impression of the building. It's going to be, or it is, elevated off the ground on these 3 mega columns, which is quite an unusual design. And I think the idea was that they would maintain the ground floor space outside the 3 Arena for pedestrians. And the key concern, particularly given the location of this building, is the wind environment, and would this be an unpleasant or even a dangerous environment in terms of wind conditions for pedestrians? An example of what I mean by that is this is a short video clip of the bottom of Bridgewater Place Tower in Leeds, and even on the most pleasant day, it is a bit of a nightmare for pedestrians like this. It's a tall building in the middle of a very low-lying area, and that tends to breed problems in terms of wind conditions. None of us like being blown away by the wind, but aside from it being unpleasant, it can actually also be extremely dangerous. And this is a small little clip from a newspaper about a pedestrian who was killed due to an overturning vehicle where wind was deemed to be the problem. And this is at the foot of that tower in Leeds I was talking about a moment ago. So this came to me during the design phase a number of years ago, where there was concern that these kind of wind issues might be present at the base of this new building. And this is where my work in computational fluid dynamics was important. So what I mean by computational fluid dynamics is the idea of using computers and computer modeling and taking the equations that describe fluids and fluid dynamics, and using the computers to solve these equations to give us meaningful information, meaningful data. And it's quite broad, because a fluid, it could be air, it could be wind, it could be noise, water, obviously, fire, smoke, hot air, cold air, and anything at all that behaves as a fluid can be modeled using this methodology. So I developed a computational fluid dynamics model. This is just a couple of screenshots of what the raw model looked like. And it takes into account all of the fine details of bus stops and roads and cables and anything and everything that was relevant to the environment. And I run the model taking the prevailing wind conditions. And what we're seeing here on the left-hand side is a plan view where I've chopped off the top part of the building. And what we're looking at is those 3 mega columns in the middle. And these red areas are very high-speed winds that are whipping in underneath the building, coming from the west. And then this second image here on the right is an elevation view showing how the wind is interacting over the height of the building. And what we found was that there were wind speeds in excess of 15 meters per second regularly occurring, even on what might be an average day. But what does this even mean? Like, if we're not meteorologists, what does 15 meters per second imply? So the Beaufort Scale and the loss and comfort criteria give some information on this. So if we have a wind speed of less than 1 meters per second, It's going to be very pleasant to sit and read a book, to eat outdoors, to stroll around and to walk. And as that speed increases, and the photographs on these slides are kind of meant to give an indication of what you might experience. It's, you know, at 6 to 8 meters per second, it's not going to be pleasant to read or to eat. You might be okay strolling, but you'll tolerate transiting from one place to another. So as we get up towards that 15 meters per second that I was talking about, we're at the level of trees coming down, and it being incredibly, not just unpleasant or annoying, but dangerous. Dangerous for the general public and dangerous for cyclists. And we didn't observe speeds higher than 15 meters per second in this case, but above that threshold, it's dangerous even for able-bodied people. So coming back to what I found, this is extremely dangerous. What can we do about it? Typically what I find is when we get to this point, the architect, the designer, they really don't want to be changing their design. You know, they've put a lot of thought into this. They like their design. So what can we do? And part of what we looked at in terms of mitigation, we looked at things like the orientation. Does slightly changing the orientation of the building in relation to the wind, does that improve things? Can we look at things like staggering, where you know, if you imagine the way New York is laid out, wind can whip down an avenue or a street uninhibited. But if buildings are staggered a little bit, it can be much more pleasant. Can we avoid corners, which tend to be high-speed zones? Can we look at preventing funneling issues, using screens, using trees, or indeed if there are downdraft issues where a tall building is catching the wind at a high level and directing it down towards ground, can we do something in terms of canopies that might help? Or indeed balconies. You know, there's many different designs of balconies that can be adapted for particular setups that will make the area much more pleasant for occupants. So looking at all these potential mitigation measures, what we proposed back to the design team was the inclusion of a wind canopy along one side of the building. So this middle image is an image of the model looking on the west side of the building, where a 1.5 meter canopy would be included. And what we were able to demonstrate was that this downdraft wind that was whipping down and causing that high-speed wind underneath the building before the canopy was included virtually vanished after the canopy was included. And this data, this information was really valuable to the design team to demonstrate beforehand, before construction, before anything was permanent, that there was a really simple mitigation that we could include here. And ultimately planning was granted, and you'll see from this, whoops-a-daisies, you'll see from that slide that was dated 2016. So I believe and I expect that this building is now constructed and visible. So I was involved in this work, it was probably 5 or 6 years ago. A second project in a somewhat similar nature was Apollo House and Hawkins House, and these buildings were in the news for various reasons over the years. It was decided that they were going to be demolished and replaced with new buildings. My involvement in this project was in relation again to the wind environment. And to summarize, because I'm conscious of time, I developed 5 different models as part of the assessment of the impact of the proposed development on the wind microclimate. So the initial geometry was very much a massing geometry, those red buildings on the left. The first geometry was on the right. The existing buildings were presented on the left. And the first step was to demonstrate that the new design was not going to result in more adverse conditions for the wind than what was there in the existing context. So in a similar fashion to the last project, I developed a computational fluid dynamics model again. So you'll see that kind of turquoise thing in the middle, that's the River Liffey. And the surrounding buildings are kind of brown, and the buildings of interest are there kind of in peach, in a pink color in the middle. So in essence, we modeled nearly 3 square kilometers of Dublin City. And we did that a number of times. So with that first geometry, we found there were quite a number of issues where there'd be high speed winds around some of the corners, that there'd be wind coming down from a high level, along Tara Street was going to be problematic, and so on. So we, in essence, found some issues, reported back to the design team. And so they came back to us then with the second iteration of the geometry. And there had been many of the initial issues had been resolved. And there was a third iteration of the geometry. At this point, we recommended some canopies. There was a fourth iteration, and there was a fifth iteration, and eventually we converged on the final design. And what was really, I suppose, exciting for me in this project was that it was about really influencing the design at a point where it could be influenced. So this kind of back and forth iteration in the design meant that we were solving potential problems before they even happened. It wasn't a case of the building was built and then it was dangerously windy and then we try and retrofit something. It was being involved in that design process from the very beginning and iterating back and forth with the design team. So construction on this project is at a much slower pace than the exostructure, but I'll be excited to see how it turns out in the end. So that kind of brings to a close what I was hoping to talk about today. In essence, it's modeling work using computers, using the equations of fluid dynamics that generates data, that provides data to us that can be really beneficial in the design of the built and constructed environment. So at that point, I guess I'll hand back to Orla, and thank you all very much for joining today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was really fascinating. And I think particularly when you described the design process by being there at the beginning of the design process, you can actually use that data to solve questions or challenges around comfort in the urban environment. And I have questions, but maybe we'll leave them for later in relation to urban space and the scale of towns, and how computational fluid dynamics might be used, or is it being used, to shape the design of public spaces. But for now, thank you so much. It was really, really fascinating. I'm going to now introduce our last speaker today, Luke Kelleher. Luke is teaching fellow in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy, and teaches across a number of environmental policy courses. Luke has been involved in town centre mapping since joining UCD in August 2016. And his initial interest began when his second year GIS planning group took part in a pilot Heritage Council Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme, which we know has really gained traction in recent years, and headed up by Allison Harvey there in the Heritage Council. Since then, Luke has gone on to teach and focus his research within environmental policy, but he's retained an interest and involvement in the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme. And he's going to speak today about his initial experiences within the programme and the feedback received from both participating students and local councils. So Luke, you'll be speaking about mapping town centres, and I'll hand over the Zoom to you. You're just still muted there, Luke.
Sorry, I think I uploaded my slides a bit too early there, but I take it everybody can see them. I'm good to go. Yeah. So yeah, like Orla said, my presentation is going to be more focused on my experience within the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme rather than my own specific research. I'd like to talk about how I became involved in that programme, talk about how I integrated into teaching within UCD and the feedback I received from both students and the local councils on the participation of that programme. So just a quick overview of presentation. So just going to do a brief introduction to myself because I don't actually fit in with it. I'm not a typical fit for the Town Centre Health Check candidate. And then I want to talk about the programme. I'm going to use today just a case study of Monaghan Town Centre, who were the first partners that I used with when I took part in the scheme for the first time. Just briefly go over some of the key lessons learned, and then feedback from the council partner, and just talk about my role in the programme today. So forgive me for putting this up my own research agenda, but I really just put this up to show that, you know, I'm not a typical fit for mapping town centres. My background's in GIS and transportation planning. I did my PhD at Queen's alongside Karen, actually at the time, or not alongside Karen, but worked with Karen. And since then, I've worked in a wide variety of transport-related and climate-related research. And in January 2022, I'm going to be starting part-time lectureship, or a lectureship between UCD and Chang and Dublin International College of Transportation. So why I picked that up is I'm not a typical fit for the mapping of town centres. Where town centres first came into my horizon was when I was teaching in the School of Planning at UCD, and I took part in the pilot Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme with my class, and I remained within that, remained contributing to that project up until present times. And it's good to see that, as Orla said, it's really gaining traction. And it was good to see that the Town Centre First policy being included in the agreed programme for government. So just, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, but for those who aren't, I just wanted to just give a brief context to the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check. So Ireland's Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme was created by the Heritage Council and its partners in autumn 2016, UCD being one of those, alongside Queen's and various other third-party institutions. And that was, at the time, it was aimed to establish a collaborative and robust approach to undertaking town centre health checks in Irish towns. And where I thought, you know, I could contribute to this programme in particular was in terms of creating a data-driven baseline and that could support unique historic towns when benchmarking their performance against each other. So no longer anecdotal evidence, you know, solid objective baseline data. I took this diagram from the Heritage Council Town Centre Health Check programme website, which I'd encourage you to check out. But it just shows that the wide variety and the collaborative approach that was undertaken within that programme. I mean, in total, I think since it's began, the pilot programme was 9 towns, but now I know, talking to Allison Harvey recently, that there's a waiting list of up to 45 towns across the country looking to participate. And the beauty of the programme is its collaborative approach. So it's not only government agencies and local groups, but it's also bringing into bringing the third level institutions into play. And also, it's obvious that, you know, such a programme obviously supports the national planning framework, national development, and the key elements of the spatial regional development of Project Ireland 2040. So just by way of context, how I came about to be part of the project, back in 2016 when the project was kicking off, I was teaching fellow in the School of Planning, and I was put in touch with Allison Harvey, and we discussed the pilot scheme, and I thought it offered a great opportunity to incorporate the Town Centre Health Check into my GIS, Introduction to GIS module. There's an obvious overlap. That module was basically about introducing, you know, new students to the concepts and organization of GIS. But it was important not only to incorporate the objectives of the town centre health check, but also to meet the teaching objectives of my module. So for successful completion for both parties required an integrated approach. So there was a lot of meetings between myself, the Heritage Council, and Monaghan County Council. And also the students really bought into the fact that both Monaghan County Council and the Heritage Council came to speak to them a number of times during the course of that module. Just to briefly go, I'm using this as an original case study, but there's been subsequent field trips since. But the first field trip took place back in November 2016, when the students made a field trip to Monaghan. Back at the time, Monaghan was obviously feeling the effects of the Brexit uncertainty. That was having a key impact on the currency differential. So Monaghan County Council really bought into it, and they recognized that the local authority had a role in making the town or the county more attractive to live in and to entice investment. And in order to do that, they recognized that they needed good, effective, objective baseline data. So there's the group on the day, and I've just put on the left-hand side here. In order to meet the teaching requirements, we split the town into 6 survey zones. The students really bought into it. The town mayor came to meet us. There was collaboration with Monaghan County Council staff, and I mean the student engagement was very high throughout the day. There's the students, so it wasn't just a mapping exercise. There were many more elements to meet the needs of the module. So in terms of outcomes, the students used census data to give the council the socioeconomic profile of the town. They provided land use survey data, undertook vacancy rate, and also undertook footfall surveys. And all this was done under the learning objectives of the particular module. This is a copy of the final map that was provided for Monaghan County Council. Not only was it a final map provided, but it was also shapefile data that they could then incorporate into their own GIS system and use for future modeling. So the key lessons learned from that exercise were it really was important that there was cooperation between the council and third level institution. We benefited greatly from having good cooperation with each of the councils we worked with then and since then. And there's also a requirement for OSI data agreement, so it was important to get the Ordnance Survey Ireland involved. There's also an obvious requirement of accurate data collection when mapping these town centres if the data is going to be fit for purpose. And one of the key elements that Allison, myself, and a number of the other participants worked on was the creation of an Irish Town Centre Health Check land use classification, something that could be used to compare like for like across towns, which was one of the key elements of the project. It was necessary to have good input from the local authority because it's wide variation in student quality, student work, and obviously if this is going to be used by council, it needs to be QA'd. There was intense data cleaning process. We also found things like surveying above ground floor were really, we just focused the work on ground floor surveys only. But the student engagement, like I said, there was a multidisciplinary research approach, and it fitted in well with the remit of planning and GIS, and the student engagement was positive. In terms of Monaghan County Council's feedback, well, as Orla, as you mentioned, there's a need for more data. I took this at the bottom right-hand corner, that's from 2019. Even then in the Irish Times, they were saying Ireland needs more detailed land use maps, so it fits in perfectly. At the time of the Monaghan surveys, prior to that, Monaghan County Council had only carried out their own in-house survey back in November 2013, so they were very happy to get an updated data set. And what we provided with them was the database that could be reviewed annually, and has been subsequently. It allowed for analysis of land use activity. It informed the review of their current development plan. It focused on areas for renewal and helped them identify a major scheme in part of the town. And it was an evidence-based approach to regeneration. The pilot was warmly welcomed by Monaghan, and it provided an opportunity for collaborative approach, both on our part and on theirs. And I have to say that the Monaghan Town team and residents had a very warm welcome for the students, and have done in subsequent meetings. The Monaghan County Council overall feedback were that there was a good relationship with UCD, and that's continued with other modules within planning. And they identified the importance of effective GIS resource in local authorities if we are to have a robust data set. One of the benefits of the original collaborative or pilot approach was the idea of the 10 pilot towns all learning and benchmarking from each other. So that was a key point in terms of developing this classification that could be used for future reference. And Monaghan County Council also were very happy with the opportunity to work again with third level, and would warmly be welcomed. So with that in mind, we worked together again the next year. Just a final couple of slides, and worry of time here, but following that GIS-based module, my colleague Paula Russell in planning was able to use that data with her with a follow-on module on land plan making, and that looked in more detail specific town centre areas and provided the opportunity for the students to apply their more in-depth planning knowledge on top of this objective data. So finally, I just think it'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Allison Harvey and Tara Buckley when I was mentioning the town centre health check. So I've just to give an acknowledgement to Allison for all her hard work on the scheme. Although I'm not now working in planning, I still do work for her because she's so persuasive and enthusiastic on the scheme. She's managed to bring together the 4 pillars and highlighted the need for effective town centre management to achieve revitalisation. My current role is just to help to peer review GIS data, but I'm happy to give anybody any information if they'd like to follow up on this presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's really interesting. I mean, I've had some dealings with Ali Harvey over the years in relation to this model, and her tenacity, I think, in continuing to drive it to inform the emerging town centre first policy, the need for good data, the need for collaborative interdisciplinary work on town centres, I think has just been phenomenal, actually. So it's really interesting to hear about it from the kind of both the educational perspective, I think, and also a little bit about the building of that GIS platform. So I have a question which I just wanted to ask you before we go to the open up the Q&A. So if anybody does have any questions, just a reminder to pop them in the chat for Luke or for Karen or for Jennifer. I wonder, could you say a little bit, Luke, about the land use classification system? Because it strikes me, and I know land use classification, in particular in relation to vacancy and dereliction, is a really hot topic now, about how we measure that that information around vacant buildings. And of course, it has to do with time, dynamics of changing vacancy, but also ground and upper floor level vacancy. And as I mentioned earlier, in response to, I think, Cleena O'Sullivan has a question in the Q&A about plans for collecting data and who does it. In Housing for All, it is the Department of Finance that is charged with collecting this data, and that's linked to the local property tax information. So I think that's really interesting in itself. The Heritage Council pilot obviously developed. Could you speak a little bit about developing that GOAD system and the land use classification, and has it developed over time? And is it now, do you think, is this something you could roll out to every town?
Yeah, so it has developed over time. At the time we used the GOAD classification, Alison identified that as a good fit, but obviously over time we've identified that it's needed to be added to, and that's something Alison, myself, and a couple of the other partners have worked on, sort of cyclical terms. But we feel that I've been now involved in this for about 5 years, and I think we've settled on a final classification which works well. In terms of working above ground floor, I mean, I identified it took a lot of guesswork in the first time I went to Monaghan, that we just decided, you know, it's just best just to focus most accurate data. If we're going to be talking about accurate, robust data, it needs to be just ground floor only. Otherwise, we were going, you know, making guesses whether it was storage or whether it was, you know, what was the use above ground floor. If you had to take a guess, then it was just going to devalue the whole data set. So the classification has really been a modified version of the goal with additional input from all members to get where we are at the minute, which we're quite happy with in terms of a classification. But it's really focused on ground floor only. Still on mute.
Ollie, you're on mute there.
You're on mute, Orla.
I thought I pressed it, excuse me. You know, I was just saying that that is one of the main challenges, I think, around trying to gather probably layered data sets, that we seem to have a lot of data in different forms, but that maybe what we're lacking is the right questions to ask to allow us to use these data sets in a layered way that might be able to indicate, for example, vacancy, but also land use. So, you know, it strikes me, for instance, the census is amazing, but it does only measure residential dwelling information, and it's at quite a large time interval. Miriam has
I think one point I should have made there would be, I think it's essential that, you know, if the classification is going to be fit for purpose, and all towns use the same classification or use the Heritage Council defined classification, not only that, we need to have a defined way of how vacancy is calculated. You know, what's retail vacancy, what's residential vacancy, what's town centre vacancy. Those are key issues that have arisen over the years too.
And that ties nicely, I think, into Miriam Fitzpatrick's question, which is, would you have any recommendations for CFIT or for the Heritage Council to scale up land use data in towns? As Miriam says, there aren't enough third levels to cover all of the towns needed. So are there practical ways in which that could be kind of scaled up and scaled out quickly?
Well, I think that it really is for the local authorities to get involved. I mean, the land use mapping itself isn't a particularly difficult task, but it's important that it's done accurately. So I've been doing a lot of peer reviewing on students working on in different towns since then, but I mean, it's not something that would be on the realms of a GIS officer at a local authority to take control of this. And I think that would probably be I mean, as Miriam says there's not enough third level institutions, so it's really up to the local council or the county councils to take charge. And there's an awful lot of benefit for them all to have this sort of robust data set, but it's important that if they do take charge, they do it within the remit of, you know, I'm not saying it's like a file, but the remit of using a classification that can be compared to elsewhere rather than creating their own classifications.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more that a consistent comparative data set are really, really important. Geodirectory is also interesting to add into that mix because it gives you that kind of boots on the ground, using the everyday knowledge that post-delivery staff have of their local areas, and that they input a kind of dynamic data into the geodirectory sets. But again, if all of these sets are modeled using different classifications, for example, it's very difficult to bring them together. So I think you know, there's work to be done, but highlighting all of the different models and how they might be combined into one consistent comparative model that would allow you to parse it for different criteria, I think could be, by the sounds of it, achievable and also really, really useful. I'm going to just ask, I was kind of burning question for Jennifer, which was in relation to computational fluid dynamics and public space in towns, maybe, because I'm interested in what you might have to say about the potential for that kind of knowledge and skill and data to influence how we design public space in towns.
And I'm conscious that the two examples that I shared were of Dublin city centre and not necessarily representative of all of the various possibilities around the country. But in theory, it's entirely transferable. It is a case of extracting from something like Google Maps the terrain of the area of interest. So this could be at a quite local level and a number of buildings, or it could be at a much more broad level, taking, for example, OSI data, which I've done in the past too, where you might have a terrain, particularly in mountainous areas that can be quite windy. So there's an enormous scope to look at variety in terms of scale, as well as different orientations, different wind directions. You know, while we might intuitively know that the southwesterly winds are the prevailing ones for Ireland, in local areas it might be the easterly wind, where there's a sheltering effect from mountains to the west, and so on and so forth. So there's enormous opportunity to do what I've done in those two examples, but for anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. And those two examples were for buildings, but in theory, the object of interest could be a sculpture, it could be a bridge, it could be any form of infrastructure. So in a kind of a way, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, and I think that you know, even hearing about that potential for modelling, I think is it could spark different ways of different applications for it in terms of urban design, which I think might be really interesting. And also I like the idea that it's not just wind, but could be used potentially for water systems as well. And I'm not sure if that is the case, but it sounds like particularly
certainly. Well,
yeah.
A colleague of mine that you'll know, Sarah, who's on the call, where we have a student at the moment, and we're looking at the design of constructed wetlands. Using the same methodology. So a constructed wetland is a means of treating water. And that's a very important aspect of the built environment. So the applications are wide ranging. I just figured I'd focus on wind for today, but certainly water, fire, smoke, hot air, cold air. There's quite a lot of interest in data center modeling actually at the moment, because you certainly don't want the hot air exhaust from one data building, one data hall, being sucked in as supposedly cold air conditioned air into a neighboring data hall. So there's a lot of interesting modeling work going on in that space as well at the moment in terms of optimizing efficiency of those. So I fear I could have bored the ears off you all day with different applications, but I stuck with wind for today.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think the potential then to combine that with both architectural design, building design, and urban design, as well as systems and infrastructure design, is really huge. Karen, I'm going to just go to you in relation to, I suppose, participatory planning and data, and I really just to pick up on the point that you said that everyday lives were the most difficult to measure in terms of data, but gave the richest information, or the most informative information. Could you give some examples of how data about everyday lives is collected, and what types of data you might mean, and how that richness could be used to shape the spaces of towns?
I think I was highlighting it as a challenge, and I suppose it is the focus of that participatory approach, in the sense that if we are going to co-design, it's about recognizing that the people living in the places have a voice. And I thought both Jennifer and Luke's presentations were really interesting, because, you know, you might look at, I think even to learn about, say, Jennifer, your modeling and with the wind, like, I think, you know, why not bring the community in on that and engage with it and understand how places work? Because we all know, you know, as we work through maybe public spaces or urban spaces in our towns, what maybe the problems are, or issues or barriers, or why don't we sit on that side of the square possibly because it's too, well, generally in Ireland, too windy. So I think it's actually, I thought that, I'm not answering your question, Orla, but I thought having those three presentations are really interesting. And what I like about what we're doing at the Centre for Irish Towns is bringing in the interdisciplinary side of things, that it's a mix. Sorry, I have children just home from school here, so they're probably making noise outside the door. In terms of the everyday lives, I suppose, for me, that's, as a geographer, really important. And I sometimes call it everyday geographies, because we live our lives day to day. We generally, we live somewhere, we go to work, sometimes we work from home, we drop kids to school, we do our shopping, we do all those elements. And I think what I want to see more is how we actually capture data. And I am starting a project on that, where we're going to be exploring methodologies to do that, there's a dual process in that. It's about capturing the everyday data, but it's also about including people in data collection to understand how we create evidence bases and make decisions. So one thing we can do is ethnographic research, and we can also do like daily diaries and ask people to record where they go and what they do and how they use places. And it's very labor intensive work. It's really qualitative, and that's why I say it's the most challenging. But if we're fortunate enough to, get support to fund that type of research, it's really, really positive. We can do it on really nice granular scales, and that's what I'm hoping to do over the next couple of years in a project.
Yeah, I think it is. We've often used kind of the analogy of storytelling. We're trying to capture stories, and then that leads back to the point you made, I think, about representation. And I was struck, I suppose, about the common link between all three presentations is the ability to represent the data that you're gathering, the stories that you're gathering, whether that's about, dangerous wind spots around a building or a public space, or the correct type of classification of land use, or co-designed participatory data that can input into, the correct type of response and ways to shape towns. So I think it does seem we're in a really exciting place actually at the moment that can harness many different types of design thinking and system thinking, and combine those together so that we should be able to make really informed decisions that are participatory, that observe both the science of the place, but also the nuanced humanity and occupation and lived lives of spaces. And I think bringing those together is certainly one of the ambitions of the Centre for Irish Towns, but also that it's so relevant to actually the reality of the lived experience of towns and future challenges that they face. I'm conscious of time, that we've exceeded our allocated lunchtime slot. So I'm just going to conclude, I think. I just wanted to wish to firstly thank all of our speakers today, to Karen Keaveney, to Jennifer Keenan and Luke Kelleher. As I mentioned, this is the first in what will hopefully be a monthly series from now on. So thank you to everybody for tuning in. Thanks again to Katrina, Pauline, and Sarah for organising the series. And we'll see you again in a month's time. Do come along for our next session, and thanks again to everybody.